Hello there, and welcome to our channel. Tonight the focus settles gently on a set of ancient clay tablets shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. Hands that press symbols into wet earth to record a story not of wonder, but of necessity. These texts suggest that long before the first cities rose between the rivers, something had gone wrong elsewhere. They do not describe the arrival of the Anunnaki as a grand exploration, but as a response to a crisis that could no longer be ignored. What survives is a tone shaped by obligation and scarcity. If this space brings you any sense of calm, a quiet gesture of support helps the stillness reach others. For now, there is no hurry. The story moves at its own pace. Tonight, the focus settles gently on a set of ancient clay tablets, shaped by hands that lived thousands of years ago. Hands that press symbols into wet earth without knowing how far those marks would travel. These texts were not written to impress us or to mystify future generations. They were practical, administrative, and sometimes deeply anxious. Within them lies a recurring theme that feels less like legend and more like pressure, a sense that something had gone wrong elsewhere, long before the first cities rose between the rivers. If this space brings you any sense of calm, if the steady unfolding of old ideas helps the noise of the day loosen its grip, we can allow the past to breathe together. For now, there is no hurry. The Sumerian canon is not a single book or a unified scripture. It is a vast, fragmented archive of memory. It is a collection of thousands of tablets, some no larger than a palm, others heavy and imposing. When we look at these artifacts, we are looking at the foundational records of a civilization that claimed its knowledge was a gift. But the language of that gift is surprisingly heavy. The Sumerians did not describe their gods arriving out of curiosity. They did not frame their presence as a grand exploration or a benevolent descent motivated by wonder. What survives instead is a different tone altogether, one shaped by obligation, scarcity, and necessity. The language used in these tablets carries weight. It speaks of labor, of burden, and of decisions made because alternatives were disappearing. When read carefully without modern assumptions layered over them, the narrative that emerges is not one of visitors seeking adventure, but of beings responding to a crisis that could no longer be ignored. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the earliest texts, are not distant abstractions. They are administrators, supervisors, planners, and enforcers of order. Their authority is described in functional terms. They measure, they allocate, they command, and they judge. Their hierarchy is clear, and their duties are assigned. This is not the language of myth as entertainment. It is the language of systems under strain. Repeated references to toil, exhaustion, and unrest suggest a society struggling to maintain itself. Even the divine realm, as recorded by Sumerian scribes, appears constrained by limits. In several accounts, the heavens are not portrayed as an eternal sanctuary. They are depicted as a place with rules, resources, and consequences. The texts speak of cycles that must be managed, materials that must be acquired, and outcomes that must be prevented. This framing matters. It places the Anunnaki within an environment that can fail, a place where conditions can worsen, where balance can be lost, and where intervention becomes unavoidable. The name of their world, often translated as Nibiru, is mentioned sparingly and without elaboration. It is not romanticized. It is not described in sensory detail. Instead, it is referenced in connection with movement, transition, and alignment. The implication is subtle but persistent. Their home was not static. It was subject to change. Something about its state required action, not contemplation. One of the most telling patterns in the tablets is the emphasis on extraction. Gold, in particular, appears repeatedly. It is not listed as ornamentation, but as a substance of importance. It is handled with care and assigned a purpose. The texts do not describe it as a symbol of wealth. They describe it as functional and necessary. When read through a modern lens, this has often been dismissed as metaphor or misinterpretation. But within the logic of the texts themselves, gold is not decorative. It is instrumental. The idea that a civilization would cross immense distances for survival is not extraordinary. Human history offers countless parallels. When resources decline, populations move. When environments destabilize, migration follows. The Sumerian tablets, stripped of later embellishment, suggest something similar unfolding on a far larger scale. A decision made not out of desire, but out of compulsion. Earth in these accounts is not introduced as a paradise. It is described as suitable, viable, and rich in what was needed. The tone is almost administrative. The locations are assessed. Rivers are named. Conditions are evaluated. This is not the language of awe. It is the language of planning under pressure. The planet becomes a solution, not a destination. The arrival itself is not celebrated. There are no grand ceremonies described. Instead, there is work, organization, and the division of tasks. The Anunnaki are said to establish operations quickly, as though time mattered, as though delay carried risk. This urgency is echoed in repeated references to labor disputes among them. Certain groups are described as burdened beyond endurance. Complaints are recorded and tensions rise. Eventually, a breaking point is reached. It is here that the texts take a turn that later generations would struggle to reconcile. Faced with internal unrest and unsustainable demands, a decision is made, one that alters the course of life on Earth. The creation of a workforce fashioned to bear the labor that the Anunnaki could no longer sustain themselves. The language used is careful. It does not speak of inspiration or art. It speaks of problem solving. Humanity in these earliest descriptions is not the focus of affection. It is the result of necessity, formed through deliberate action, shaped for function and assigned a purpose. The moral implications of this are not explored in the texts. They are simply stated. What mattered was survival, continuity, and relief from an unbearable strain. Yet even within this framework, limits appear. There are references to rules that were tested, lines that were crossed, and consequences that followed. The tablets do not present the Anunnaki as immune to error. They describe disputes, punishments, and regret. Over time, the narrative becomes quieter. Certain explanations stop appearing. Details fade. What remains are rituals, kingship, and memory filtered through human experience. This silence is as important as what came before it. The absence of explanation suggests a withdrawal or stepping back. Perhaps the crisis that forced the arrival had been stabilized. Perhaps the cost of involvement had become too great. The texts do not say. They simply shift focus. Human rulers take center stage. Divine intervention becomes less direct. Authority remains, but the distance grows. What makes these accounts unsettling is not their strangeness, but their familiarity. The story they tell mirrors patterns seen again and again. A civilization under pressure seeks resources. It exploits what it finds. It creates systems to manage labor. It enforces order. And eventually it retreats, leaving lasting consequences behind. The Sumerian scribes did not frame this as a warning. They recorded it as history, or at least as close to history as memory and tradition allowed. Their concern was continuity, preserving what had been established, and ensuring that the structures left behind continued to function. As the narrative moves forward, the tone continues to shift. What began as urgency becomes governance. What was once survival becomes legacy. Humanity inherits a world shaped by decisions made long before it could consent or object. The tablets remain silent witnesses to motivations that feel uncomfortably practical. There is no neat conclusion offered, no moral resolution, just a sense that something was set in motion and that its momentum carried forward through generations. The Anunnaki fade from direct involvement, but their influence persists in laws, myths, and hierarchies. The story does not end here. It simply changes its focus, moving from arrival to consequence, and from necessity to inheritance. The quiet weight of those ancient decisions continues to shape what comes next. Long before Earth is described as a destination, long before rivers are measured or soil is assessed, the oldest Sumerian tablets turn their attention upward, not in wonder and not in worship alone, but in record. The sky, as it appears in these texts, is not a distant abstraction. It is active, structured, governed, and at times unstable. The heavens are treated as a place where events occur, where order can be disrupted, and where consequences ripple outward. This framing matters because it sets the stage for everything that follows. Earth is not chosen in isolation. It is chosen in response. The earliest tablets do not open with creation in the way later mythologies do. They begin instead with division. The heavens are assigned. Domains are allocated. Authority is distributed. The sky is not infinite and formless. It is organized, layered, and regulated. The Anunnaki are introduced within this system not as eternal beings floating beyond material concern, but as participants within it. Their status is high, but their responsibilities are clearly defined. They answer to structure. They operate within limits. Celestial movement is referenced repeatedly, though rarely explained. Certain bodies are described as crossing paths, aligning or returning. The language is observational rather than symbolic. These are not poetic flourishes meant to inspire. They read like notes taken by people who watch the sky carefully, because what happened there mattered directly to life below. The heavens were not just a realm of gods. They were a system whose behavior affected outcomes. One recurring theme is balance. The texts speak of order being maintained through proper alignment. When alignment fails, disruption follows. This is not framed as punishment or moral judgment. It is mechanical cause and effect. When certain conditions are met, stability exists. When they are not, instability spreads. This way of thinking reflects a worldview shaped by agriculture, irrigation, and seasonal dependence. The Sumerians understood that systems could fail quietly at first, then suddenly. The sky in these records behaves like such a system. There are references to periods of calm followed by periods of disturbance. The language becomes heavier in these sections. Terms associated with strain, burden, and threat appear. These are not metaphors for emotional states. They are applied to the heavens themselves. Something about the cosmic environment is described as becoming difficult to manage. Notably absent from these early passages is any suggestion that the Anunnaki exist outside of this instability. They are not immune observers. They are involved. Their actions are framed as responses. Decisions are made, councils convene, and authority figures intervene. This implies that whatever was unfolding in the heavens carried real risk, not just symbolic meaning. The idea that the sky could be dangerous is not unique to Sumer. Many ancient cultures feared celestial events. But the difference here lies in specificity. The tablets do not speak in vague terms of omens alone. They reference processes, movements, and cycles. The heavens are not simply watched. They are managed. This suggests a level of engagement that goes beyond ritual observation. In some fragments, the heavens are described as crowded, not with stars, but with activity. Roles overlap. Responsibilities strain against available capacity. There's a sense that too much is being demanded from too few. This mirrors later descriptions of labor unrest among the Anunnaki themselves. The pattern begins here, above, before it ever touches Earth. The concept of scarcity appears subtly but persistently, not scarcity of space, but of stability. The texts imply that certain materials, conditions, or processes essential to maintaining order were becoming harder to sustain. This is not stated outright. Instead, it is inferred through emphasis. When something is mentioned repeatedly in administrative texts, it usually signals importance under pressure. Gold, even at this early stage, is mentioned in connection with the heavens. It is not treated as treasure, but as a substance tied to function. Its properties are not described, but its value is implied by context. It appears in lists of materials associated with maintenance and restoration. This alone does not prove anything extraordinary, but it establishes continuity. The same substance later sought on Earth is already significant before Earth enters the narrative. The heavens are also depicted as hierarchical. Certain regions are closer to authority. Others are more distant. Access matters. Movement between these regions is regulated. This again frames the sky as a place, not an idea. A place with borders, permissions, and consequences for transgression. When boundaries are crossed without approval, repercussions follow. In several passages, the language shifts from observation to concern. Terms associated with warning appear. Not prophecy, but notice. Something is approaching. Something is changing. The response is not panic, but preparation. This distinction is important. Panic implies helplessness. Preparation implies agency. The Anunnaki are portrayed as actors with limited but meaningful options. The notion of travel is introduced carefully. Movement between realms is possible, but not casual. It requires deliberation, resources, and authorization. This further reinforces the idea that when Earth is eventually chosen, it is not an impulsive act. It is the result of a process already underway for some time. The heavens then are not a paradise lost through pride or sin. They are a system under stress. The tablets do not moralize this stress. They document it. This practical tone runs throughout the earliest records. The scribes were not concerned with telling a dramatic story. They were concerned with preserving information that mattered. One striking feature of these texts is their lack of sentimentality. There is no nostalgia for a golden age in the sky, no lament for what was lost. The focus remains on what must be done. This suggests that the crisis, whatever its nature, unfolded gradually enough to normalize adaptation. When survival depends on adjustment, longing becomes a luxury. The heavens are also described as cyclical, but not eternally so. Cycles can degrade. Patterns can drift. When this happens, intervention is required. This view aligns with modern understandings of complex systems. Stability is not permanent. It must be maintained, sometimes at increasing cost. Another detail worth noting is the absence of creation language at this stage. The tablets do not describe the heavens being made. They describe them being governed. This implies that the scribes inherited a worldview in which the cosmic order already existed, and their concern was continuity, not origin. Earth, when it enters a narrative, follows the same logic. It is not created in these texts. It is utilized. The role of leaders like Enlil and Enki, though not named repeatedly here, is hinted at through functions. One oversees order and command. The other oversees adaptation and problem solving. This division of roles appears first in the heavens. Only later does it extend to Earth. The pattern is consistent. The same strategies used above are applied below. The earliest tablets also hint at limits to authority. Even the highest figures operate within constraints. Decisions require consensus. Disputes arise. Authority is not absolute. This is a subtle but critical point. If the Anunnaki were omnipotent in the Sumerian imagination, there would be no need for deliberation. The presence of debate implies uncertainty. Uncertainty, more than anything else, defines these passages. The future is not assured. Outcomes are not guaranteed. The heavens are not collapsing, but they are no longer reliable. Something essential is becoming harder to sustain, and ignoring it is no longer an option. Earth does not appear yet as a solution, but the groundwork is laid. The problem is established. The tone is set. The sky, once stable enough to fade into the background, has become a source of concern. Attention shifts outward, not in curiosity, but in necessity. This is where the narrative quietly turns. Without announcement or emphasis, the perspective begins to widen. The heavens are no longer the only point of reference. Other realms are implied. Other possibilities exist. The tablets do not rush to name them. They simply allow the idea of elsewhere to enter the record. In this way, the choice of Earth is not sudden. It is the next logical step in a sequence already in motion. A system under strain seeks relief. Relief requires resources. Resources require a location. And so, attention begins to drift away from the heavens that could no longer fully sustain what depended on them. The scribes who recorded these thoughts did not know how their words would be read millennia later. They were not trying to convince or entertain. They were preserving a memory of pressure, of systems stretched thin, and of decisions made because delay was no longer viable. As the focus slowly shifts from the sky to what lies below it, the tone remains the same, practical, measured, and unembellished. The heavens have been assessed and their limits acknowledged. What comes next follows naturally from that realization, as attention turns toward a world that had not yet been chosen, but had already been noticed. One marked in the clay as a place of potential, not because of its beauty, but because of its utility. This is the beginning of the decoding, the slow peeling back of the administrative layer, to see the crisis that brought the heavens down to the dust of the earth. Long before Earth is assessed for its rivers or its soil, the oldest Sumerian records turned their attention toward a home that was no longer sufficient. This place, referred to as Nibiru, is not described in the earliest fragments as a paradise or a distant heaven of perfect peace. In the administrative language of the tablets, it appears instead as a system under immense and growing strain. The scribes do not use poetic language to describe its decline. They do not speak of a tragic fall from grace or a moral failure that led to its instability. Instead, they record the mechanics of survival. They document a shift in environmental conditions that made continuity impossible without direct intervention. This framing is essential to understanding everything that follows. The Anunnaki did not come to Earth out of a desire for expansion or a spirit of curiosity. They did not arrive as explorers, seeking the unknown. They came because their own world had become a place of scarcity. Specifically, the scarcity of protection. When we read these ancient texts without the layer of later myth and modern romanticism, a very practical problem emerges. The tablets speak of a world where the atmosphere was thinning, where the balance of life was drifting toward a critical threshold that could no longer be ignored. There are references to the heat of the sun becoming unbearable and the coolness of the night failing to return in its proper measure. These are not descriptions of weather as we understand it. They are descriptions of a failing shield. In the logic of the tablets, the sky of Nibiru required active maintenance. It was not a self-sustaining canopy that existed beyond the reach of change. It was a managed environment. When the management of that environment began to fail, the consequences were described as immediate, systemic, and unavoidable. The response of the Anunnaki was not panic. It was a cold calculation of resources and time. One substance appears in the records with a frequency that signals its absolute importance: gold. In modern interpretations, gold is often seen as a symbol of wealth, a currency, or a material for decoration. But in the earliest Sumerian accounts, gold is treated as a substance of function. It is listed alongside materials used for sealing, for protection, and for restoration. The texts do not describe it as something to be traded or hoarded for its beauty. They describe it as something to be used. When read through the lens of a civilization facing an atmospheric crisis, the role of gold becomes instrumental. It was a material needed to mend the sky. By suspending refined particles of this substance in the upper reaches of their environment, the Anunnaki sought to create an artificial shield, a way to reflect the harshness of the sun and retain the warmth of the world within. This was not a project of vanity or ornamentation. It was a project of desperation. The tablets record the councils that met to discuss this requirement. They document the assessments of how much material would be needed and where it might be found. Nibiru itself, though described as rich in many things, lacked the volume of gold necessary for sustained restoration of its atmosphere. The crisis was not just that the sky was failing. The crisis was that the solution was out of reach. This is the moment where the narrative shifts from internal management to an external search. The heavens were surveyed, not for wonder and not for the sake of science alone, but for materials. The Sumerian scribes described this search in terms that feel remarkably bureaucratic. There are lists of locations, measurements of distances, and evaluations of suitability. Earth was not chosen because it was beautiful or because it held some spiritual significance. It was chosen because it was a repository. It contained the specific substance required to stabilize a dying home. The arrival on Earth was therefore an industrial expedition, not a spiritual descent. The Anunnaki were administrators, engineers, and workers who had been assigned a task upon which their entire civilization depended. The weight of this responsibility is visible in the language of the tablets. It is heavy, urgent, and precise. The decline of the home world is described as a gradual and relentless process. It was not a sudden catastrophe that forced an immediate flight. It was a slow thinning of the margins. Year by year, the cycles became less predictable. The harvest mentioned in the earliest fragments began to fail. The water became harder to regulate. These are the markers of environmental drift. When a system begins to lose its balance, the symptoms appear everywhere. The Anunnaki did not wait for the total collapse of their world. They began to plan while there was still time. This suggests a civilization with a long view of history and a deep understanding of its own fragility. The tablets also hint at the internal social pressure caused by this decline. When resources are redirected toward a massive engineering project, every other part of society feels a strain. There are references to the diverting of labor and the tightening of rations. The mission to Earth was a drain on the home world even before the first vessel departed. This created a sense of urgency that permeates the records. Every day spent searching was a day where the home sky grew thinner. Every delay was a risk that could not be justified. This explains the efficiency and the perceived ruthlessness with which the Anunnaki established themselves once they reached Earth. They did not have the luxury of slow exploration or gentle observation. They had a quota to meet. Nibiru is often described in terms of its crossing. Its path brought it into proximity with other systems only at long intervals. This periodicity is a recurring theme in the texts. It meant that the windows for action were limited by the movement of the heavens themselves. If a mission was to be sent, It had to be timed with the alignment of the worlds. This adds a layer of celestial mechanics to the administrative burden. The planners had to account for time as a finite and unforgiving resource. To miss the window was to face centuries of further decline without a solution. The scribes record these alignments with precision that suggests they were the most important dates in their entire calendar. When a decision was finally made to focus on Earth, it was based on the reports of surveyors. The tablets mention the names of those who first assessed the planet. They describe the detection of the substance in the veins of the mountains and the beds of the rivers. The report was positive. The material was there in sufficient quantity. But the report also contained a warning that would define the next several thousand years. The labor would be immense. The gold was not sitting on the surface waiting to be collected. It would have to be extracted from the deep earth. This realization changed the nature of the mission. It would not be a simple collection of resources. It would be a permanent and difficult operation. The Anunnaki who were chosen for the mission were not necessarily the elite of their society. Many were workers, supervisors, and technicians. They were sent away from their home to a primitive world to spend their cycles in backbreaking labor. The texts record their complaints almost as soon as the work began. They were separated from the world they were trying to save. They were living in a foreign environment with a different gravity, a different atmosphere, and a different rhythm. The sense of isolation is palpable in the fragments. They were doing the work that no one else wanted to do, in a place they did not want to be, for a home they might never see again. This labor was the only thing standing between Nibiru and its final decay. The gold had to be mined, refined, and transported back across the vastness of the crossing. The tablets describe the logistics of this transport in great detail. They mention the vessels that carried the material and the schedules they followed. It was a lifeline, a constant flow of substance from the deep mines of Earth to the thinning sky of the home world. Without this flow, the Anunnaki on Nibiru would perish. Without the labor on Earth, the flow would stop. The administrative records show how the hierarchy was structured to ensure this process never faltered. Enlil and Enki, the figures who appear most frequently in the later stories, are portrayed here as the managers of this vast and difficult operation. One was responsible for the command and the order of the workers. The other was responsible for the technical challenges of extraction and the adaptation to the environment. Their rivalry, which is so often dramatized in later myths, is presented here as a series of jurisdictional disputes between two high-level administrators struggling with a project that was too large for either of them to control perfectly. The crisis on Nibiru was therefore the engine that drove every action on Earth. The building of the first cities, the digging of the great canals, and the organization of the first workforces were all steps in a single plan to stabilize a dying home. The Sumerian scribes were meticulous in recording this connection. They wanted it to be known that the presence of the gods was not a random event or a benevolent visit. It was a response to necessity. The heavens were failing, and the earth was the only viable solution. As we look closer at the descriptions of the atmosphere, we see terms that imply a sophisticated understanding of protective layers. They speak of the breath of the world and the veil of the sky. When the veil was torn, the life below was exposed. The gold was the thread used to sew the veil back together. This is the central metaphor of the mission: restoration, not conquest, not creation for its own sake, but the restoration of a balance that had been lost. The tablets also reveal that the crisis was not entirely resolved by the arrival on Earth. The restoration was a constant and demanding process. The shield had to be maintained. The particles of gold would eventually settle or be dispersed by the movements of the sky, and more would always be needed. This meant that the occupation of Earth could not be temporary. It became a permanent necessity. The Anunnaki were trapped by their own solution. They had saved their world. But in doing so, they had tied their fate to the minds of a distant planet. This is a quiet tragedy found within the administrative records. A civilization that reached across the stars for survival only to find itself burdened by the labor of its own salvation. The Sumerian scribes did not offer this as a story of hope or triumph. They offered it as a record of fact, a testament to the lengths a people will go to when their home is dying. The atmosphere of Nibiru, thin and failing, was the pressure that shaped the world of man. It was the reason the tablets were written, and it is the reason the past still speaks with such quiet urgency. The crisis was the beginning. Everything else was the response. The focus now shifts from the sky of the home world to the dust of the earth. The administrators have arrived. The survey is complete. The work is ready to begin. But the workers are already tired, and the earth is deeper and harder than they imagined. The next chapter is not one of victory, but of toil. The long emergency has relocated, and the ground is about to break. The records tell us that the first camps were established near the rivers where the water was needed for the processing of the ores. The heat of the earth was different from the heat of home. The gravity pulled harder on the limbs of the workers every day. Every detail of the arrival is marked by the reality of physical effort. There was no magic involved in the establishment of the first sites. There was only engineering and the sweat of those who had been commanded to save a world they would never see again. The administrative layer of the Sumerian text is the most honest account we have of this period. It does not hide the difficulty. It does not pretend the gods were happy or fulfilled. It simply states that the work was necessary and that the rules were enforced. The sky of Nibiru was a master and the earth was a servant. In that relationship, the story of humanity began, not with a whisper of love, but with the clatter of tools and the heavy breath of those who were running out of time. The home was dying, and the search for gold was the only way to keep the light from fading forever. This was the burden, and it was only the beginning. Before the great ships arrived, before the cities of the marsh were built, and before the labor was ever distributed among the many, there was one who came alone. The Sumerian accounts do not begin the story of Earth with a colony. They begin with a fugitive, a figure named Alalu. He was a king who had lost his crown, a ruler who had been cast down by another. In the logic of the tablets, his arrival on the blue planet was not an act of exploration. It was an act of desperation. It was a flight from a system that had turned against him. This shift from governance to exile is where the narrative of Earth truly starts. It is a story shaped by political failure, a stolen ship, and a gamble taken when all other paths were closed. The texts describe a transition of power on the home world that was far from peaceful. For 9 periods, Alalu had sat upon the throne. He was the one responsible for the systems of Nibiru. He was the one who faced the growing imbalance in the sky. He was the one who felt the first weight of the failing atmosphere. But his solutions were judged as insufficient. The tablets speak of a challenger named Anu, a figure of high standing who rose to contest the throne. The two had struggled, they had wrestled, and in the end, Alalu was defeated. This was not just a personal loss. It was a systemic rejection. To stay meant to face judgment. To stay meant to accept a lower place in a hierarchy that no longer recognizes authority. And so, Alalu chose the only alternative that remained. He fled. His flight was not a simple departure. It was a theft. The texts record that Alalu seized a sky chamber, a vessel capable of crossing the vast distances between realms. But he did not leave empty-handed. He carried with him weapons of great power, tools of destruction that were forbidden. This detail matters. It tells us that Alalu was not just a refugee. He was a threat. He was a man who had taken the means of violence with him into the void. His destination was not chosen at random. The tablet suggests that he was following an ancient lead, a knowledge of a place far away that might contain the very substance Nibiru needed to survive. He headed toward the seventh planet, the world we know as Earth. The journey as described in the Sumerian records is one of calculated risk. Alalu was not a scientist, but he was a pilot of necessity. He had to navigate a system that was dangerous and unforgiving. One of the most striking descriptions in the tablets is the passage through what is called a hammered bracelet. Today, we understand this as the asteroid belt. The text describes it as a barrier of stones, a place where the sky is broken, a region where movement is restricted and death is constant. To pass through it was to test the limits of the sky chamber. Alalu did not pass through it with ease. He used the weapons he had stolen to clear a path. He blasted through the stones. He forced his way through the debris of an older catastrophe. This was not a journey of wonder. It was a journey of survival. When he finally emerged on the other side of the bracelet, the seventh planet lay before him. The tablets describe Earth in its earliest state, a world of water and clouds, a world that was blue and inviting, but entirely unknown. Alalu did not descend with a sense of triumph. He descended with an assessment. He needed to know if this world could sustain him. He needed to know if the air could be breathed. He needed to know if the substance he sought was actually there. The landing was not a graceful arrival on a landing pad. It was a splashdown. The text suggests he landed in the waters, perhaps in the region we now call the Persian Gulf. The sky chamber settled into the marshes. The silence that followed must have been heavy. The silence of a man who was the only one of his kind on an entire world. The first actions Alalu took upon arrival are recorded with administrative precision. He did not build a temple. He did not offer a prayer. He tested the environment. He stepped out of his vessel and encountered the atmosphere of Earth. The tablets describe the first breath of a visitor on this planet as a moment of realization. The air was viable. The water was life-sustaining. But more importantly, the instruments he carried began to signal the presence of what he needed. Gold, the substance that could save the atmosphere of his home world, was present in the waters and beneath the soil. In this moment, the narrative shifts from a story of exile to a story of leverage. Alalu was a fugitive, but he now possessed the greatest secret in the cosmos. He held the key to Nibiru's survival. He had found the solution that had eluded him during his kingship. This gave him a way back, not as a servant, but as a savior. He used the communication systems of his stolen ship to send a message across the void. He reached back to the very system that had rejected him. He spoke to Anu, the man who now sat upon his throne. The message was simple. I have found the gold. I have found the salvation of our world. But it came with a price. Alalu wanted his status restored. He wanted his exile ended. He wanted his actions forgiven. The response from the home world was not immediate. The tablets imply a period of deliberation. A council was held. The news was assessed. The gravity of the discovery outweighed the crime of the theft. The emergency on Nibiru was still worsening. The need for gold was becoming absolute, and so a deal was struck. The system would respond to the discovery. They would send a mission to evaluate Alalu's claim. They would send others to this blue planet to begin the work of extraction. This was the beginning of the Anunnaki presence on Earth. It did not start with a grand plan for humanity. It started with a bargain between a deposed king and a desperate throne. What makes this account so distinct from later mythologies is its lack of sentimentality. Alalu is not portrayed as a hero of the people. He is a complicated actor in a failing system. His motives are selfish. His methods are violent. His arrival is accidental. Yet his actions set the entire course of history into motion. The Sumerian scribes recorded this as a sequence of cause and effect. If the coup had not happened, Alalu would not have fled. If he had not fled, he would not have taken the risk of passing the bracelet. If he had not passed the bracelet, Earth would have remained unnoticed. The entire presence of the Anunnaki on this planet is built upon the foundation of a political crisis and a desperate escape. The atmosphere of Earth during this first exile is described as being in a state of wild abundance. The texts mention the rivers, the fish, the fruit, and the animals. But Alalu did not enjoy these things as a tourist would. He stayed by his ship. He monitored his surroundings. He waited for the arrival of those who would judge his claim. There is a sense of profound loneliness in these passages. The loneliness of a ruler who has lost everything and is waiting to see if he can buy his way back. He was the first to name the features of the land. He was the first to map the marshes. He was the first to understand the wealth that lay hidden in the depths of the seventh planet. When the next ship finally arrived from the sky, it carried with it the figures who would become the architects of Earth's future. Enki, the son of Anu, was the one chosen to lead the first party. He was the master of waters, the problem solver, the one who could turn Alalu's discovery into a functioning operation. The meeting between the exile and the prince is described with a tension that feels real. Alalu was the former king. Enki was the son of the new king. They stood together on the shores of a world that belonged to neither of them, but would soon be reshaped by both. The texts do not describe their interaction as friendly. It was a professional encounter. Enki assessed the ship. He assessed the water. He confirmed the presence of the gold. The mission was validated. The exile had been right. This confirmation changed the status of Earth forever. It was no longer a distant possibility. It was now a strategic site, a place of interest, a location that required infrastructure, labor, and oversight. Alalu's gamble had paid off, but his role was already beginning to diminish. Once the experts arrived, the fugitive was no longer the master of the world. He was a guide, a provider of information, a man whose usefulness was being traded for his survival. This first exile established a pattern for everything that followed. It introduced the idea that Earth was a place where problems from elsewhere were solved. It established the blue planet as a resource to be managed, and it brought the first of the Anunnaki into contact with an environment that would eventually change them as much as they changed it. The Sumerian tablets do not look back on this moment with nostalgia. They look back on it as the moment the pressure moved from the sky to the ground, the moment the long emergency found a new theater of operation. As the first camp was established, a place called Eridu, which means home in the far away, the reality of the work began to set in. Alalu had found the gold, but he had not extracted it. He had found the water, but he had not channeled it. The work was massive. The scale was beyond the capacity of a small group. The urgency of the home world was still pressing down. Every moment spent in assessment was a moment the atmosphere of Nibiru continued to thin. The transition from discovery to operation was fast and unforgiving. The story of Alalu's flight is a reminder that the beginnings of history are often messy. They are driven by individuals who are flawed, by systems that are breaking, and by decisions made when there is no other choice. The blue planet was not a destination of hope. It was a destination of last resort. And as the first fires were lit in the marshes of Eridu and the first sky chambers were prepared to return to home world with samples of the golden prize, the true weight of the mission began to be felt. The fugitive had found a world. Now, The system would have to find a way to make that world work. This framing of the first arrival matters because it removes the sense of inevitability. It suggests that if Alalu had failed to pass the bracelet, the story of humanity might never have happened. If Anu had not taken the throne, the flight would not have occurred. We are looking at a history built on a series of accidents and responses to crisis. The Sumerian texts preserve this sense of fragility. They tell us that the Anunnaki did not come because they were gods. They came because they were desperate. And they found Earth not because it was special, but because it was there when they needed it most. The first exile was over, but the long labor of the blue planet had only just begun. The silence of the marshes was about to be replaced by the sound of machines, the voices of workers, and the heavy rhythm of a civilization attempting to outrun its own end. This was a foundation. This was a start. And the logic of the tablets suggests that once the first step was taken, there was no way to turn back. The seventh planet was now part of the system, and the system was hungry for more. When the first descent is recorded in the oldest Sumerian lists, the language does not shift into a higher register of celebration. It remains tethered to the ground, to the mud, and to the specific requirements of the mission. The arrival is not described as a triumph of the spirit. It is described as a placement of resources. The site chosen was Eridu, a location that would later be remembered as the first city, but which began as something far more practical. It was a station. It was a site selected for its proximity to what was needed and for its capacity to support the first phase of operations. The texts do not describe the builders arriving with songs. They describe them arriving with tools. They describe them measuring the marshes, assessing the flow of the water, and establishing perimeter. This was the beginning of the material presence of the Anunnaki on Earth, and the tone of the records suggests that every move was calculated under the weight of the emergency that had driven them there. The figure at the center of this establishment is Enki, also known as Nutamud, the master of the deep in later mythologies. His domain is described in poetic terms as a subterranean ocean of sweet water. But in the earliest administrative layers, his role is much more technical. He is the engineer. He is the one who understands the properties of the environment and the requirements of the systems that must be built. The Apsu, the deep water associated with his name, is not presented as a mystical realm in these early notes. It is presented as a resource for cooling, for power, and for the management of the station. Enki does not enter the marsh out of a love for nature. He enters it because it provides the necessary conditions for the work that must be done. The choice of Eridu was strategic. It was a place where the earth and the water met in a way that could be manipulated. The texts speak of the 50 who descended with him. This number is repeated across different versions of the story, and it suggests a specific crew size. It was a team of specialists. They were not settlers. They were technicians tasked with building the first house, the Iabzu. We are told that this house was built from the reeds of the marsh and the mud of the bank, but its purpose was not domestic. It was the hub of the station. It was where the decrees, the Mi, were kept. In later stories, the Mi are treated as magical objects or divine powers. But when read through the lens of these early administrative records, they behave like technical specifications. They are the blueprints. They are the protocols for agriculture, for metallurgy, for governance, and for the maintenance of order. To hold the Mi was to hold the instructions for the system. Enki established Eridu as the place where these instructions would be enacted. There is a sense of immense isolation in these early descriptions. The texts do not mention other cities because there were none. They do not mention other civilizations because the mission was the only organized presence on the planet. The environment is described as viable but demanding. The marshes were thick, the heat was persistent, and the work was slow. This was the long emergency transitioning from a plan into a physical reality. The first 72 days are often cited as a period of intense labor, a time when the first foundations were laid against the resistance of the swamp. The language used is one of measurement and allocation. So much mud was moved, so many reeds were cut, so much land was reclaimed from the water. This is not the vocabulary of myth. It is the vocabulary of a construction log. The arrival of the seven, often referred to as the Abgal or the Apkallu, is a recurring theme in the memory of Eridu. These figures are described as emerging from the water, often depicted in later art as wearing fish-like garments. While this has been interpreted symbolically for centuries, the earliest records frame them as teachers and experts. They brought with them the knowledge required to stabilize the environment. They did not bring poetry. They brought the knowledge of how to drain the land, how to build canals, and how to organize the first rudimentary forms of industry. The Abgal were the ones who implemented the me under the direction of Enki. They were the ones who turned the station into a functioning site. Their association with the water may reflect the reality of their work in the marshes, or perhaps the nature of their arrival, but their impact was entirely structural. They established the rules by which the station would function. As Eridu took shape, the pressure of the mission began to manifest in the way the station was managed. The texts describe a hierarchy that was strict and functional. Enki oversaw the technical operations, while his brother Enlil remained in the heavens, overseeing the broader strategy and the flow of resources. This division created a tension that would define the entire history of the Anunnaki on Earth. One was focused on the ground, on the adaptation of the system to the local environment. The other was focused on the objectives of the homeland. Eridu was the site where these two perspectives met. It was the place where the abstract requirements of Nibiru had to be translated into the mud of the earth. The record suggests that this translation was never perfect. There were disputes over priorities. There were complaints about the difficulty of the work. There was a sense that the station was never quite enough to meet the demand. The naming of Eridu is itself a significant act. In many interpretations, the name carries the meaning of the distant home or the house built afar. It was a reminder of what had been left behind, but it was also a declaration of presence. By naming the site, they were claiming it as part of their administrative structure. It was no longer just a marsh. It was a coordinate. It was a point on a map that now included the Earth. The establishment of the station marked the end of the survey phase and the beginning of the operational phase. The time for observation had passed. The time for extraction and management had begun. The clay tablets record this transition with a quiet gravity. They do not describe the beauty of the sunset over the water. They describe completion of the first canals. One of the most telling details in the record of Eridu is the focus on the water systems. Enki is repeatedly praised for his ability to direct the flow of the rivers. This was not an act of worship. It was an act of survival. In a world where the mission depended on stability, the management of water was the most critical task. Without it, the station could not be cooled. Without it, the personnel could not be sustained. Without it, the resources could not be transported. The Iabzu was positioned at the very edge of the deep water, allowing the crew to monitor and manipulate the environment with precision. The language of the text suggests that the Apsu was a tool, a complex mechanism that Enki understood better than anyone else. He was the master of the deep because he was the master of the system that kept the station alive. The isolation of the first crew meant that they had to be entirely self-sufficient. There were no supply lines from other parts of the world. Everything had to be manufactured or extracted on site. This placed an immense burden on the 50 who descended. They were the architects, the laborers, and the administrators of a new world. The texts reflect a society that was entirely oriented toward the completion of the mission. There was no room for leisure. There was no room for deviation. Every hour was accounted for. Every resource was allocated. This was the reality of the station at Eridu. It was a high-stakes operation conducted in an environment that was indifferent to their survival. The silence of the marshes around them was a constant reminder of how far they were from the homeland and how much depended on their success. The descent of the Seven and the establishment of Eridu represent the first time that the logic of the heavens was imposed on the earth. Before this, the planet had its own rhythms, its own cycles, and its own balance. After the station was built, a new layer was added, a layer of rules, of measurements, and of goals. The Earth was now part of a larger plan. It was no longer a wild place. It was an asset. The tablets do not reflect on whether this was a positive or negative development. They simply record it as a fact. The station was there. The me were in place. The work had begun. The momentum of the mission was now physical. It was carved into the land in the form of canals and buildings. As the years passed and the station grew, the records show that Eridu became the template for everything that would follow. The methods developed there, the ways of organizing labor and managing resources, would be replicated as the mission expanded. But Eridu would always be remembered as the beginning. It was the place where the Anunnaki first touched the mud and realized the scale of the task they had undertaken. The desperation that had driven them from the sky was now meeting the resistance of the earth. The long emergency was no longer a theoretical problem to be discussed in councils. It was a physical burden to be carried every day. The marshes of Eridu were the first testing ground for a civilization that was fighting for its continuity. And the silence of the records from that time reflects the intensity of that struggle. The station was not a temple. It was not a palace. It was a node in a network of survival. When we read the later myths of Enki and the building of his house, we are seeing the memory of this operational center filtered through thousands of years of human storytelling. But if we strip away the poetic flourishes, what remains is a story of engineering under pressure. A story of a crew trying to build a stable foothold in an unstable world. The descent of the Seven was the deployment of experts. The establishment of Eridu was the activation of a ground site, and the work that began there would eventually reshape the entire planet. Not because it was meant to, but because the mission required it. The clay remains as the only witness to those early days, preserving the administrative details of a time when the heavens first made their home in the mud of the earth. The station at Eridu was the first of many, but it was the one that set the tone. It was a place of rules and requirements. It was where the first 70 who came down learned the limits of their endurance and the complexity of the world they had chosen. The text suggests that they did not find what they were looking for immediately. There was a period of trial and error. There was a period of adaptation. But the mission did not pause. It could not. The necessity that had driven them from Nibiru was still present, still pressing, still demanding results. And so they continued to dig, continued to build, and continued to measure. Eridu was a starting point for a narrative that would soon encompass the entire globe. But in those first days, it was just a small cluster of buildings in a vast and silent swamp, a fragile station held together by the me and the determination of those who had been assigned to the task. The logic of Eridu was the logic of the outpost. It was built to be efficient. It was built to be secure. It was built to facilitate the next stage of the mission. The descent of the Seven was the first sign that the mission would require specialized knowledge to succeed on the surface. These were the experts who ensured that the station could function in the long term. They were the ones who turned the marsh into a resource. The records of their deeds are sparse, but their influence is visible in every canal and every foundation stone. They were the engineers of the first reality, and as the station became stable, the focus began to shift once again. The ground had been secured. The station was operational. The resources of the earth were now within reach. The next phase was ready to begin, and the hunger of the system was about to find its first true satisfaction in the depths of the earth. When we look back at the oldest records of Sumerian people, we find a word that appears with frequency that suggests something more than a mere location. That word is Abzu. In later mythologies, the Abzu was reimagined as a mystical place, a subterranean ocean of fresh water where the gods resided in a state of eternal calm. It became a symbol of the subconscious, a deep well of wisdom from which all life emerged. But the earlier tablets, those shaped by a more practical and perhaps more desperate hand, described something else entirely. In these records, the Abzu is not an abstraction. It is a site. It is a destination. It is the primary focus of an operation that was as much about logistics as it was about survival. Tonight, we move our attention away from the sky and toward the depths of the earth, where specific material need dictated the course of history long before the first human cities were built. If this exploration offers you a moment of stillness, a chance for the rapid pulse of the modern world to slow its beat, consider a quiet gesture of support through a like or subscription. This small space for deep thought remains here because people like you value the slow unraveling of the past. For now, we continue. There is no hurry. The story reveals itself in layers, much like the earth that the Anunnaki were so determined to open. To understand the Sumerian texts, one must understand their relationship with materials. These were people who lived between the rivers, who understood the weight of clay, the flow of water, and the permanence of stone. When they recorded the activities of their gods, they did not describe them performing miracles of magic. They described them engaging in the difficult, repetitive work of resource management. And at the heart of this management was a hunger for gold. This has often been dismissed by modern scholars as a later cultural obsession or a metaphor for the divine light. But the language of the tablets is stubbornly literal. Gold is listed alongside copper, tin, and wood. It is measured in quantities that exceed the needs of any jewelry or decorative art. It is assigned to supervisors. It is tracked through transport routes. It is the reason for the Abzu. The Abzu is described in these early texts as the lower world. It was the domain of Enki, the figure associated with engineering, adaptation, and the hidden mechanics of the world, while his counterpart Enlil oversaw the command of the heavens and the cities of the surface. Enki was tasked with the depths. The texts describe him journeying to the Abzu, not to retire in luxury, but to oversee a project of immense scale. The geography of the Abzu in the earliest records is consistent. It is described as being distant from the primary settlements. It is reached by crossing water. It is a place where the sun does not reach, where the heat is intense, and where the work is unending. When we read these descriptions without the layer of later religious sentiment, a different picture emerges. The Abzu reads like a mining operation. It is a region identified for its specific mineral wealth, chosen because it held the key to a problem that could not be solved in the heavens. The hunger for gold was not a desire for wealth, as we understand it. Wealth requires a market. Wealth requires an economy. The Anunnaki, as they are described in the oldest tablets, were not traders. They were administrators of a system in crisis. Their need for gold was functional. It was a requirement for their survival, a substance that possessed properties essential to the stabilization of their own world. In several fragments, there is a subtle but persistent link between the acquisition of gold and the state of the atmosphere. The language is archaic, but the implication is clear. The gold was not meant to sit in vaults. It was meant to be used. Some interpretations suggest it was processed into a fine particulate, a dust that could be suspended in the air to serve as a shield or a thermal regulator. Whether this is an accurate scientific reading of the technology is less important than the way the texts frame the motivation. The gold was needed to preserve an environment that was failing. The hunger was not born of greed. It was born of desperation. This realization changes how we perceive the labor of the Abzu. The Sumerian tablets describe a group of beings known as the Ijiji. In the later traditions, these were minor gods who served the Anunnaki. But in the oldest accounts, their role is defined by toil. For 2,500 years, the texts say, the Ijiji bore the load. They dug the trenches. They cleared the canals. They descended into the depths of the Abzu to extract the substance that their leaders demanded. The language used to describe their work is visceral. It speaks of the way of the soil, the heat of the shafts, and the way the years began to erode their endurance. This was not a celebratory labor. It was not an act of worship. It was industrial. The supervisors are described as demanding. The quotas were strict. The logistics were unforgiving. The Abzu was a place of efficiency because it had to be. Time was a factor. The emergency elsewhere did not pause because the digging was difficult. The hunger of the system required constant feeding. This is why the Abzu held the key. It was the source of the only material that could buy them more time. The tablets describe Enki as a master of the Abzu, someone who understood its rhythms and its secrets. He is shown designing the tools, mapping the veins of the earth, and organizing the flow of materials. His authority was not based on religious, all but on technical competence. He was the one who could make the Abzu yield what was needed. But even his competence had limits. As the depth of the mines increased, so did the difficulty of the task. The air grew thinner. The heat grew more oppressive. The strain on the Ijiji grew until it could no longer be ignored. The texts record complaints. They record the rising tension between those who performed the labor and those who directed it from the surface. This is a remarkably modern narrative. It is the story of a workforce pushed beyond its capacity to serve a goal they did not fully share. The Ijiji were not stakeholders in the salvation of the homeland. They were the ones tasked with the physical cost of that salvation. Their resentment is documented in a way that feels raw and immediate. They speak of their broken tools, their tired limbs, and the unfairness of their assignment. The Abzu thus becomes the stage for a great transition. It was here that the limits of the original plan were tested. The Anunnaki had arrived with a specific goal and a specific method. They believed their system of labor and oversight would be sufficient to secure the gold they needed. But the Earth is a difficult environment. The Abzu was deeper and more resistant than they had anticipated. The hunger for the material was constant, but the ability to provide it was faltering. When we look at the word Abzu today, we might see it as a name for the abyss or a poetic term for the ocean. But to the scribes who first pressed it into clay, it was a coordinate of pressure. It was a location where the long emergency met the reality of hard labor. It was where the golden hunger demanded more than the gods could give. The key was held in the Abzu not because it was a place of wisdom, but because it was a place where the mission would either succeed or collapse under its own weight. As the narrative progresses, the focus on the Abzu intensifies. The logistics of the extraction become the central concern of the administrative tablets. Every decision made by the Council of the Gods began to revolve around the productivity of the mines. The tension between the heavens and the deep grew. Enlil, the commander of the surface, demanded results. Enki, the master of the depths, face the reality of a failing workforce. The crisis was no longer just about the atmosphere of a distant world. It was now a crisis of management on Earth. The hunger for gold had created a system that was becoming unsustainable. The Ijajai were nearing their breaking point. The Abzu, for all its wealth, was becoming a place of rebellion rather than a place of resource. The Sumerian texts tell us that the tools were eventually cast into the fire. The laborers refused to descend. The silence of the mines became louder than the command of the heavens. The hunger was still there. The need was still absolute. But the hands required to satisfy it were no longer willing to move. It is at this moment that the story takes its most profound turn. The hunger of the system did not disappear when the labor stopped. Instead, it demanded a new solution. It demanded a new kind of worker, one that could bear the weight that the Ijajai had discarded. The Abzu had provided the material, but it also revealed the limitation of the creators. To move forward, the Anunnaki would have to do more than mine the earth. They would have to intervene in the very nature of life itself. The golden hunger was the catalyst. The Abzu was a laboratory. And what followed was a decision that would forever alter the course of our world. But that is a story for the next layer of the record. For now, we remain in the deep. We listen to the silence of the abandoned mines. We feel the weight of the responsibility that had become too heavy to carry. The past is not just a collection of names and dates. It is a record of pressure and the choices made to relieve it. The hunger for gold had brought them here, but it was the reality of the Abzu that would force them to become something they had never intended to be. The story moves at its own pace. The texts do not rush. They allow the weight of the situation to settle. The Abzu was a place of depths, and we have only just begun to understand what was buried there. As the focus shifts from the material to the biological, the tone of the tablets remains administrative, practical, and deeply anxious. The system was hungry, and its satisfaction would require a price that would be paid in breath and blood, far beneath the light of the sun. In the heart of the Abzu, the next phase of the narrative begins not with a victory, but with a compromise made in the shadows of the earth, where the golden hunger found its answer in the creation of a new existence. The key had been found, the resource was identified, but the cost of the key was more than the gods had expected to pay. The story of the Abzu is the story of how necessity reshapes the world, leaving behind fragments of a history that still feels uncomfortably close to the struggles of our own time. As the quiet settles over this segment, consider the way those ancient hands pressed their symbols into the clay. They were not writing for us. They were writing to keep track of a world that was falling apart. They were recording the hunger, the work, and the silence. And in that silence, we find the beginning of our own story, shaped by a need we are only now starting to understand. The focus remains on the depths. The Abzu still holds its secrets. And the narrative continues, moving forward with the steady rhythm of a system that must survive, no matter the cost. This is the language of the tablets. This is the weight of the past. There is no hurry. The story will continue. The hunger remains, and the answer is waiting in the next layer of the clay, ready to speak slowly, and ready to give the past time to breathe. The golden hunger was not the end. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would redefine the heavens and the earth, and everything that lives between them. We leave the Abzu for now, but its influence will persist in every word that follows. The key has been turned, and the door to our own origin is finally beginning to open. The transition from arrival to operation is where the record loses its stillness. In the earlier chapters, we see the planning, the assessment, and the alignment of goals. But the tablets known as the Atrahasis epic provide a different perspective, one that is less about the grand design and more about the friction of execution. When we read these texts carefully, we find that the arrival on Earth did not result in a unified effort of equal beings. Instead, it established a hierarchy that would eventually lead to the first recorded strike in history. The Anunnaki, those who came from above, are described as the supervisors, the planners, and the ones who held authority. But below them stood the Igigi. They are often described as the lower gods or the younger generation. But in functional terms, they were the workforce. They were the ones assigned to the physical extraction of resources. They were the ones who entered the earth to bring back what was needed for the survival of their homeland. The scale of their labor is recorded with a specificity that feels heavy. The texts do not speak of days or weeks. They speak of periods. For 40 periods, the Igigi bore the work. They excavated the rivers. They cleared the channels. They dug into the deep places of the earth, a region the tablets call the Abzu. This was not the work of artisans or creators. It was the work of miners. The language used to describe their tools is practical. Shovels, baskets, and carrying jars are listed as the instruments of their daily life. These were not symbolic objects. They were the means by which a planetary crisis was being addressed, and the weight of that crisis fell squarely on the shoulders of the Igigi. The environment of the mines is described as a place of darkness, heat, and relentless pressure. It was a world away from the heavens they had left. The air was thick, the work was dangerous, and the timeline was indefinite. As the years stretched into millennia, the silence of the record begins to fill with the sound of complaint. This is not the complaint of the lazy, but the exhaustion of a system pushed beyond its structural limits. The tablets tell us that the Igigi began to speak to one another in the shadows. They counted the periods of their toil. They measured the height of the piles they had excavated. They looked at the Anunnaki who remained on the surface, those who supervised and allocated, and they felt the growing distance between the decision and the deed. This is a pattern we recognize in every human civilization that has followed. When the burden of survival is distributed unevenly, the stability of the system begins to erode. The Igigi were no longer participants in a shared mission. They had become the mission's fuel. The breaking point arrived not as a sudden accident, but as a calculated decision. The texts describe a moment where the Igigi decided they could no longer carry the basket. They gathered in council, not to ask for permission, but to declare cessation. They spoke of the heaviness of the work. They spoke of the heat that did not end. They decided to set fire to their tools. This detail is striking. The burning of the shovels and the baskets was not just an act of destruction. It was a symbolic rejection of the roles they had been assigned. By destroying the tools of their labor, they were destroying the only reason they were on Earth. They were signaling that the current arrangement was no longer viable. The mutiny moved from the mines to the surface. Under cover of night, the Igigi marched toward the house of Enlil. Enlil was the council of the gods, the one who held the authority of command. He was the administrator of the Earth operation, and it was his house that represented the system that had burdened them. The tablets described the scene with a sense of rising tension. The house was surrounded. The guards were alerted. Enlil was woken from his sleep to find his own workforce encircling his gates. This was not a plea for better conditions. It was a confrontation with the authority that had refused to see the strain. When Enlil saw the Igigi, he did not initially respond with empathy. The text record his reaction as one of fear and then of anger. He demanded to know who had incited the rebellion. He looked for a leader to punish, a single point of failure that could be removed to restore order. But the Igigi responded as a collective. They told him that every single one of them had declared war. They spoke of the toil that had become unbearable. They showed him the ashes of their tools. In this moment, the hierarchy of the Anunnaki faced its first existential threat. If the workforce refused to work, the mission to save their homeland would fail. The gold would not be extracted. The atmosphere would not be stabilized. The survival of their world was held hostage by the exhaustion of those who did the work. Enlil called for a council of the great gods. Anu, the father of the heavens, and Enki, the master of wisdom and the deep, joined him to address the crisis. The debate that followed is recorded with the dryness of a high-level administrative meeting. Enlil wanted to execute the leaders of the strike. He wanted to use force to restore the status quo. He saw the mutiny as a violation of order that could not be tolerated. But Anu, looking down from the heavens, offered a different perspective. He acknowledged that the grievance of the Ijiji was real. He stated plainly that their work was indeed heavy and their distress was great. This acknowledgement shifted the tone of the council. It moved the conversation away from punishment and toward problem solving. It was Enki who proposed a solution that would change the course of history. He did not suggest that the Anunnaki take up the tools themselves. He did not suggest that the Ijiji be forced back into the mines under threat of death. Instead, he proposed the creation of a replacement. He suggested that a new kind of being be fashioned, one that could bear the labor, carry the basket, and relieve the Ijiji of their burden. The language used in this proposal is devoid of sentiment. It is a language of efficiency. If the current workforce is failing due to exhaustion, a more durable workforce must be implemented. This is the context in which humanity enters the Sumerian record. We were not created out of a desire for children or companions. We were not shaped as a grand artistic expression of the divine. We were proposed as a logistical fix for a labor strike. We were the answer to a mutiny. The Anunnaki needed a worker who could survive the conditions of the mines, who could understand instructions, and who could function within the hierarchy without the status of a god. We were designed to be the relief valve for the pressure that was tearing the Anunnaki apart. The Ijiji, hearing this proposal, agreed to wait. The fires in the mines remained out, and the shovels remained as ash, while Enki began the process of shaping the new worker. The tablets describe this process as a collaboration between Enki and the mother goddess, Nintu. They used the substance of the earth and the essence of a sacrificed god to bind the new creation to the world of the Anunnaki, while keeping it subordinate. The result was the Adamu, the first of the human workers. When the first humans were placed in the mines, the Ijiji were finally allowed to set down their baskets. Their periods of toil were over. They were free to return to their higher status, while the weight of planetary survival was shifted onto a being that had no memory of the heavens and no choice in its creation. This mutiny in the mines is the hidden engine behind the Sumerian creation story. It explains why the gods are often portrayed as distant and demanding. It explains why labor is a recurring theme in ancient texts. It tells us that we were born into a system that was already under immense strain. Our first purpose was to serve as a buffer between two groups of more powerful beings who could no longer coexist in the same hierarchy. The silence of the mines was replaced by the sound of human labor, and the Anunnaki found the stability they had been seeking, but at a cost that the tablets do not fully explore. The Ijiji faded from the front lines of the narrative. They became the spectators of the human experiment. The Anunnaki remained as the administrators and the judges, and humanity began its long history as the bearer of the basket. When we look at the ruins of the ancient world, we are looking at the result of this transition. The great temples, the vast irrigation systems, and the deep mines were all built on the foundation of that original compromise. The mutiny was settled, the strike was over, and a new order was established. But the memory of that breaking point remains etched in the clay, a reminder that even the gods could not sustain a system built on the exhaustion of the few for the survival of the many. The story of the Igigi is a story of limits. It tells us that no matter how advanced a civilization might be, it is still subject to the realities of physical effort and psychological endurance. The gold that was so desperately needed for the heavens was paid for in the sweat of the younger gods, and then in the lives of the humans who replaced them. The mutiny was a moment where the Anunnaki were forced to acknowledge their own constraints. They could command the heavens and move between worlds, but they could not make the work any less heavy. They could solve the problem of extraction, but they could only do so by creating a new problem, the problem of managing a living, breathing workforce that would eventually grow, multiply, and seek its own place in the world. As we move forward in the narrative, the focus shifts from the mines to the cities, and from the labor of the gods to the governance of men. The emergency that brought the Anunnaki to Earth was stabilized by the creation of humanity, but the pressure did not disappear. It merely changed its shape. The basket was passed from the Igigi to the Adamu, and with it, the responsibility for a world that was never intended for us, but was built by us. The tablets remain a silent witness to that transition, a record of a time when the earth shook not from the movement of the stars, but from the feet of a workforce that had finally reached its breaking point. The mutiny in the mines was the end of one era and the beginning of another, an era where the sky and the earth were forever linked by the labor of creation that was never supposed to be, but became the only way for the creators to survive. The silence that followed the mutiny in the mines was not the silence of peace. It was a heavy, breathless quiet of the system that had reached its breaking point. In the oldest Sumerian accounts, this moment is not described with dramatic music or sweeping cinematic imagery. It is described as a crisis of management. The labor had stopped. The gold, which we have already seen was instrumental to the survival of the Anunnaki homeland, was no longer being extracted. The fires of the lower world had been extinguished. The tools had been broken, and the council of the gods was left with a problem that could not be ignored. It is here that the narrative turns its focus toward a single figure, a being whose role within the tablets is consistently tied to adaptation, water, and the clever resolution of impossible constraints. Enki. Enki is not portrayed as a king in the way we might understand the term today. In the administrative logic of the Sumerian scribes, he is more like a chief engineer or director of biological systems. He is the one who understands how things flow, how things grow, and how things can be modified to meet a requirement. While other figures in the divine hierarchy demand obedience or enforce order through strength, Enki operates through insight, and the insight he offered in the wake of the mutiny was one that would alter the course of life on Earth forever. He did not suggest that the mutineers be punished until they returned to work. He did not suggest that the mission be abandoned. Instead, he proposed a gambit, a biological solution to a logistical failure. The language used in the tablets to describe this proposal is remarkably clinical. Enki does not speak of a grand vision for humanity. He does not speak of companionship or the desire to be worshipped. He speaks of a substitute. He points to the existence of a creature already present on the planet, a being that was suitable but not yet capable. His suggestion was to bind the essence of the Anunnaki to this creature, to refine it, to adjust its capacity until it could bear the burden that the gods themselves could no longer sustain. This is the moment where the narrative shifts from geology to biology. The focus is no longer just on what could be taken from the earth, but on what could be shaped within it. This process is often called creation, but in the earliest layers of the Sumerian record, it feels more like triage. Triage is what happens when a system is failing, and a decision must be made quickly to preserve the whole. The Anunnaki needed labor. The earth provided a biological template. Enki provided the method. To the Sumerian mind, this was not a miracle, it was a procedure. The text described the use of clay, but they also described something else, something often translated as essence or blood. When read without the layers of later religious interpretation, this suggests a mixing of materials, a grafting of one system onto another. The goal was simple: to create a worker, a being with the intelligence to follow instructions, but the physical endurance to work in the heat of the mines. This framing of our origins is quietly unsettling. It suggests that we were not the intended goal of the universe. We were a contingency plan. We were a solution to a labor strike. The Sumerian scribes do not shy away from this. They record it with the same detachment they used to record the price of grain or the repair of a canal. This detachment is important because it reveals the mindset of time in a world shaped by necessity. Function is a primary measure of value. The creature that Enki proposed to create was valued for what it could do, not for what it was. This is why the earliest descriptions of humanity in these texts are so focused on labor. We were given hands to work, minds to understand command, and bodies to endure. The implementation of this gambit required more than just Enki. The tablets introduce another figure here, Ninhursag, often called the mother goddess or the birth mother. But in the context of this biological mission, she behaves more like a lead technician or a specialist in incubation. The texts describe a sequence of trials and errors. They do not present the creation of the first human as a sudden, perfect success. They describe failures, beings that could not work, beings that could not sustain themselves. This detail is crucial. If the story were a pure myth of divine omnipotence, there would be no reason to include failure. But if the story is a memory of a difficult biological process conducted under pressure, then failure is exactly what we would expect to see. The scribes record these early versions with a cold eye. They describe the physical limitations of the unsuccessful attempts. They describe the adjustments made by Enki and Ninhursag. They describe the refinement of the process. This suggests a period of experimentation, a time when the biological solution was still being tested and calibrated. The urgency of the situation is reflected in the persistence of their efforts. They did not stop when it became difficult. They could not stop. The emergency in the heavens and the labor stoppage on earth left them with no choice but to succeed. The biological solution was the only path forward that allowed the mission to continue and the hierarchy to remain stable. When the successful version finally appears, the being we have come to know as the Adamu or the first man, there is no celebration recorded in the oldest tablets. There are no hymns of praise for the beauty of this new creation. Instead, there is the assignment of tasks. The worker is placed in the mines. The burden is transferred. The pressure on the lower-ranking Anunnaki is relieved. In the logic of the system, the gambit had worked. The disruption had been managed. The gold could flow once more. The silence of scribes regarding any emotional response to this success is telling. It reinforces the idea that the creation of humanity was an administrative act, a technical achievement that solved a pressing logistical problem. This lack of sentimentality is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the Sumerian texts for a modern reader to reconcile. We want our origins to be meaningful. We want to be the focus of the story. But in these records, we are the background. We are the equipment that allows the main characters to proceed with their original objective. Enki is credited with the solution, but his motivation is not love for the creature he shaped. His motivation is the preservation of the order he serves. He is the master of waters, the one who knows how to irrigate a desert. And in this case, he irrigated the biological void with a new form of life, a form designed for utility. As the narrative moves forward from this point, we see the consequences of this gambit beginning to unfold. The created workers were not static tools. They were biological beings. They could reproduce. They could learn. They could communicate. And they were now a permanent part of the terrestrial landscape. The Anunnaki had solved their labor crisis, but they had introduced a new variable into their system, a variable that would eventually grow, change, and demand its own form of recognition. But at the moment of creation, that was a distant concern. The immediate need had been met. The biological solution was in place. The silence that followed the creation was different from the silence that followed the mutiny. It was the silence of a factory floor that has returned to work. The rhythmic sound of tools, the steady movement of resources, the return of predictability. The burden had been shifted from the gods to the shoulders of a being that had no memory of a time before labor. This is the shadow that hangs over the Sumerian accounts of our beginning. It is a story of a long emergency that found relief in the creation of a servant. It is a story of a system that prioritized its own continuity over the autonomy of the life it brought into being. When we read these tablets today, we are looking into a mirror that does not flatter. We see the practical, administrative reasons for our existence. We see the urgency that drove our design. We see the logic of a civilization that viewed life as a resource to be managed. Enki's gambit was successful, but it was a success born of desperation. It was a choice made because the alternative was collapse. And as the story continues, we begin to see that even a biological solution carries a cost. The creators had solved their problem, but they had also created a legacy that would eventually outlast the mission itself. The goal would be taken, the mines would eventually be closed, and the Anunnaki would eventually recede. But the workers would remain. The contingency plan will become the inheritance. The Sumerian scribes did not offer an ending to this part of the story. They simply recorded the transition. They showed how one era of labor ended and another began. They documented the shift from divine toil to human toil with the same steady, rhythmic focus they applied to everything else. They left us with a record of a solution that worked. A solution that was clever, efficient, and deeply indifferent to the beings it produced. And in that record, we find a quiet way of a past that does not need to be worshipped to be felt. It only needs to be allowed to speak, slowly and in its own time. The biological solution was not the end of the struggle, but it was the end of the silence. The world was now filled with a new sound. The sound of a creation carrying a burden it was never meant to choose, but was shaped to bear. The transition from the decision to the act is where the Sumerian tablets move from the language of the courtroom and the council chamber into the language of the workshop. When the burden of labor among the Anunnaki reached its breaking point, the solution was not found in prayer or in a return to their homeland. It was found in the deliberate manipulation of what was already present. This section of the record is often referred to as a creation myth, but when read with a focus on the syntax and the specific terms used by the scribes, it functions more like a technical manual or a set of laboratory notes. The place where this work occurred is given a name that translates to the house of fashioning or the bit shimti. It is not described as a temple or a palace. It is described as a site of production, a place where components were gathered and where a specific outcome was pursued through trial and error. The language used to describe the creation of the primitive worker is grounded in materials and processes. There is a persistent mention of clay, but within the context of these tablets, clay is often a placeholder for biological substance, something that can be molded, shaped, and given structure. It is not an abstract clay of the earth. It is a material that requires the addition of something else to become viable. The texts speak of an essence or a life force that must be extracted and combined. This is not framed as a miracle. It is framed as an extraction. A specific being is chosen, and from that being, a substance is taken to be mixed with the clay. The scribes use terms associated with binding, mixing, and purification. These are the words of a chemist or a biologist, not a poet. The focus remains on the procedure. If the goal was to inspire wonder, the text would dwell on the mystery of life. Instead, they dwell on the reliability of the mixture. The two primary figures overseeing this process are Enki, the administrator of wisdom and water, and Ninti, whose name means the Lady of Life or the Lady of the Rib. Their relationship in these texts is not one of romance or divine union. It is a relationship of oversight and execution. Enki provides a plan, the instructions, and the essential materials. Ninti provides the craftsmanship, the physical labor of the molding process, and the biological environment necessary for the worker to take form. They operate as a team within a system that has a deadline. The urgency that drove the mission to Earth is still present here. They are not creating for the sake of beauty. They are creating because the extraction of gold has stalled, and the unrest among the workers has become a threat to the entire operation. The tablets do not suggest that the first attempt was successful. This is perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of the Sumerian account. In most mythologies, the creation of humanity is a singular, perfect act. In the Sumerian record, it is a process of trial and error. There are descriptions of beings that were formed but were not functional. Some could not see, some could not hold tools, some could not reproduce. The texts list these variations with a detached clarity. They are not described as tragedies or as cursed beings. They are recorded as failures of the process. They are prototypes that did not meet the requirements of the mission. This clinical perspective reinforces the idea that the Anunnaki were working within limits. They were not omnipotent. They were experimenting with the technology they understood, but could not perfectly control under the conditions they faced on Earth. Each failed attempt provided data that allowed Enki and Ninti to adjust the mixture. The language of the tablets reflects this incremental progress. They speak of refining the essence, of adjusting the mold, of changing the timing of the binding. This is the rhythm of the laboratory. It is a slow, methodical narrowing of possibilities until a viable result is achieved. The being that finally emerges is called the Lulu or the Lulu-Amalu. The name translates to the primitive worker or the one who is mixed. This designation is functional. It identifies the being by its purpose and its origin. The Lulu is not a partner or a child of the gods. The Lulu is an asset, a tool fashioned to perform the labor that the Anunnaki could no longer sustain themselves. The physical description of the primitive worker in these early texts is sparse. The scribes were not interested in aesthetics. They were interested in capacity. The worker needed to have hands that could grip tools, a back that could bear weight, and the intelligence necessary to follow instructions without the autonomy to challenge authority. The balance was delicate. Too much intelligence would lead to the same unrest that had crippled the Anunnaki workforce. Too little intelligence would make the worker useless in the complex tasks of mining and irrigation. The tablets imply that this balance was achieved through the specific blending of the Anunnaki essence with the biological material already present on Earth. The resulting being was a hybrid, a creature of two worlds, shaped by the needs of the one and the materials of the other. The moral silence of the tablets regarding this act is profound. There is no discussion of whether it was right to create a sentient being for the sole purpose of servitude. The moral implications are simply not part of the record. This absence suggests that the Anunnaki operated within a framework where survival and efficiency were the highest priorities. If a problem existed, it required a solution. If the solution required the creation of a new life form, the decision was made based on the availability of resources and the likelihood of success. The scribes recorded the act as a successful administrative intervention. The relief that follows the birth of the primitive worker is not the relief of a new parent. It is the relief of a manager who has finally found a way to meet a production quota. The Bit Shimti, the house of fashioning, is described as a place of strict regulation. Once a successful prototype was established, the process had to be scaled. One worker was not enough. The tablets describe a system of replication that involved other female beings who acted as birth goddesses. These were not deities in the traditional sense, but participants in a biological production line. They carried the shaped embryos to term, acting as the vessels for the expansion of the workforce. This detail is often omitted from later retellings because it is uncomfortable. It reduces the act of birth to a logistical step, but in the Sumerian account, it is a critical part of the story. It shows that the creation of humanity was an industrial undertaking. It was a project that required infrastructure, personnel, and a high degree of organization. As the primitive workers began to multiply, the pressure on the Anunnaki administrators eased. The gold began to flow again. The irrigation canals were dug. The cities were built. The success of the intervention justified the methods used to achieve it. The tablets record this period as one of stabilization. The crisis that had threatened the mission was resolved not by a change in goals, but by a change in the nature of life on Earth. The presence of the Lulu changed the landscape of the planet forever. They were a new variable in the system, one that would eventually grow beyond its original purpose. But at this stage in the narrative, they were exactly what they were meant to be. They were workers. They were the fulfillment of a requirement. The language used to describe the relationship between the creators and the created is one of distance. The Anunnaki are the masters, the planners, and the providers. The Lulu are the laborers, the receivers of instructions, and the bearers of the burden. This hierarchy was embedded in the very biology of the primitive worker. The tablets imply that the worker was designed to be compatible with the world of the Anunnaki, but subordinate to it. This was not a social contract. It was a structural reality. The rules that governed the workers were not laws of the state. They were the conditions of their existence. This distinction is important for understanding the Sumerian worldview. Authority was not something that was earned or negotiated. It was something that was built into the foundations of life itself. The scribes who recorded these events were likely looking back across a great distance of time. Even then, they were preserving the memory of a transition that defined their entire civilization. They did not frame it as a tragedy. They framed it as the origin of order. Without the labor of the Lulu, the world they knew would not exist. The cities, the fields, and the temples all rested on the foundation of that initial intervention in the house of fashioning. The silence of the gods regarding the soul or the destiny of the worker is consistent with this view. The worker was a solution to a problem. When the problem was solved, the worker became part of the background reality. The significance of gold in this process remained central. The worker was created to extract the material that was necessary for survival of the Anunnaki homeland. This link between human life and the extraction of resources is one of the most persistent themes in the tablets. It suggests that from the very beginning, the human experience was tied to the material needs of a higher authority. This is not a romantic origin story. It is a story of utility. But within that utility, there is a certain stark honesty. The Sumerian texts do not hide the nature of the relationship. They do not pretend that humanity was created for glory. They state clearly that humanity was forged in a lab to bear a burden that others could no longer carry. The focus settles on the completed worker. The prototype has been tested. The production has begun. The burden has been shifted. The primitive worker stands in the fields and in the mines, a living answer to a crisis that began in the heavens. The bit Shimdi falls silent, its work accomplished. The Anunnaki watch the progress from their positions of authority, their mission secured by the presence of a being that did not exist before the emergency demanded it. The silence of the tablets in this moment is the silence of a system that has successfully adapted. The unthinkable has become the routine. The worker has been born, and with that birth, the history of Earth has been irrevocably altered. The focus now shifts to the governance of this new workforce and the consequences of a creation that was meant only to serve, but which carried within it the essence of those who fashioned it. This inheritance, though minimized by the creators, would eventually become the source of a new kind of unrest, one that the laboratory could not contain and that the rules could not fully govern. But for now, there's only the work and the steady, rhythmic sound of a planet being reshaped by the hands of the Lulu, the primitive worker, forged in a lab to ensure that the mission would not fail. When the Sumerian texts turned their focus toward the place later traditions would call the Garden of Eden, they do not use the language of a mystical paradise. They use the word Eden. In the oldest records, this word identifies a specific geographic region, a steppe or a plain situated between the great rivers. It is described not as a place of leisure, but as a place of administration and intensive activity. This was the headquarters, the heart of the operations where the Anunnaki established their primary settlement and their most sensitive projects. If we strip away the layers of later mythological beauty, the Eden emerges as a managed environment, a restricted enclosure where the logic of extraction and the requirements of survival converged. It was here that the primitive worker, the Lulu, was first introduced into the system, and it was here that the most significant transition in the story of humanity took place. The earliest descriptions of the worker are stark. The Lulu was not yet what we would recognize as human. The texts describe a being that was capable of labor but lacked the markers of self-awareness. It was a biological tool, shaped to follow commands and perform the tasks that had exhausted its creators. There is a sense in the records that this first version of the worker was sufficient for the immediate emergency. It could dig, it could carry, and it could stabilize the systems of extraction. But it was limited. It was a solution to a labor problem, not an expansion of the Anunnaki lineage. In these early stages, the worker was maintained as a sterile servant, a creature that could not reproduce its own kind and therefore required constant intervention and manufacture. This was a state of high control and low complexity. It was a system that functioned, but one that demanded constant oversight. However, as the narrative unfolds within the Eden, a shift begins to occur. This shift is centered on the figure of Enki, the leader associated with adaptation, biological wisdom, and problem-solving. The text suggests that Enki grew dissatisfied with the limitations of the original design. This was not necessarily an act of compassion, though later traditions would frame it that way. In the Sumerian logic, it was an act of refinement. Enki sought to bridge the gap between the creator and the created. He looked at the Lulu and saw the potential for something more than a worker. He saw the potential for a being that could sustain itself, a being that possessed a cognitive and biological capacity to exist without constant maintenance. This transition is what the later biblical accounts would describe as the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge. In the Sumerian context, knowledge is not a metaphor for morality. It is a technical term. It refers to the acquisition of the biological blueprint, the essence that allowed for self-replication and higher awareness. To give the worker knowledge was to give the worker the ability to reproduce. This was the ultimate genetic modification. It altered the worker from a manufactured tool into a self-sustaining species. The text described this process with a sense of gravity. It was a crossing of a boundary that had been established for the safety and stability of the Anunnaki mission. The introduction of this knowledge created an immediate and profound conflict between the two primary authorities on Earth. Enlil, the chief administrator and enforcer of order, viewed this modification as a violation of the highest degree. His concern was stability. From his perspective, the worker was meant to be a controlled resource. To grant that resource the ability to reproduce and to think with a likeness to the gods was to invite unpredictability. It was a security risk that threatened the hierarchy of the entire mission. Enlil saw a future where the workers would eventually outnumber their creators, where their autonomy would lead to dissent, and where the original purpose of extraction will be compromised by the needs of a growing population. Enki, however, defended his actions as a necessary evolution of the project. He argued that a self-sustaining workforce was more efficient and that the original strain of labor was no longer sustainable for the Anunnaki themselves. This debate, as recorded in the fragments, reflects the tension between two different philosophies of management. One focused on absolute control and the preservation of boundaries. The other focused on adaptation and the acceptance of complexity. The Eden became the stage for this confrontation. It was no longer just a site of extraction. It had become a laboratory where the definition of life was being renegotiated under pressure. The text described the moment of enlightenment not as a triumph, but as a moment of realization. The Lulu became the atom, the one who possesses the essence. With this new capacity came an awareness that the primitive worker had lacked. The tablets speak of the created beings suddenly recognizing their own state, their own needs, and their own place within the system. This is the origin of the narrative of shame and clothing. When self-awareness enters a biological system, the relationship between that system and its environment changes. The workers were no longer just parts of the machine. They were participants in their own existence. Enlil's response was decisive. Since the workers had acquired the knowledge of reproduction and self-awareness, they could no longer be permitted to remain within the restricted environment of the Eden. They had become a liability to the central administration. The expulsion from the garden was not a moral punishment for a sin. It was an administrative dismissal. The enlightened workers were sent out of protected enclosure and into the wider world, specifically to the regions where the labor of the soil was most difficult. They were tasked with their own survival, forced to extract their own sustenance from the earth, while still serving the requirements of the Anunnaki. This expulsion changed the nature of the relationship between humanity and the gods forever. Before this point, the worker was a ward of the state, a manufactured entity provided for and controlled within the Eden. After this point, humanity was a separate entity, possessing the biological spark of the creators, but living under the weight of a world that was indifferent to their comfort. They had been given the gift of continuity, but they had also been given the burden of self-maintenance. They were now responsible for their own reproduction, their own food, and their own defense, all while remaining within a hierarchy that demanded their labor. The language of the tablets at this stage becomes quieter and more observational. It tracks the spread of the new human population beyond the borders of the Eden. It records the establishment of new settlements and the integration of these enlightened workers into broader infrastructure of the Anunnaki mission. There is no celebration of human freedom in these records. There is only a record of a system that has become more complex and more difficult to manage. The Anunnaki remain the masters, but their mastery now required more layers of bureaucracy, more laws, and more distance. One of the most intriguing elements of this period is the role of the serpent. In later traditions, the serpent is the deceiver, the one who brings about the fall. But in the Sumerian context, the serpent is often a symbol associated with Enki and the knowledge of life. The serpent represented the biological secret, the hidden sequence that could unlock potential. When Enki provided the knowledge to the worker, he was acting as the serpent, the one who offers a hidden truth that disrupts the established order. This was not an act of evil, but an act of intervention that favored complexity over control. The serpent was a bringer of enlightenment, even if that enlightenment led to the loss of protected, managed existence. As humanity began to multiply and spread, the consequences of the modification became evident. The humans were in the image of their creators, not just in their physical form, but in their capacity for thought, emotion, and ambition. This similarity was a source of constant tension. The Anunnaki had created a workforce that could understand them, and in understanding them, could eventually question them. The hierarchy that had been so clear during the early days of the mission was now complicated by the presence of a being that possessed the same cognitive blueprint as the masters. The Eden was left behind, but its legacy remained central to the human story. It was the site of the transition from tool to species. It was a place where the decision was made to allow humanity to persist beyond the immediate needs of the creators. The Sumerian scribes recorded this not as a grand beginning, but as a series of choices made under the pressure of a long emergency. They understood that the world they inhabited was shaped by the disagreement between Enki and Enlil, by the tension between the desire for control and the necessity of adaptation. As the narrative moves forward, the focus shifts away from the Eden and toward the burgeoning cities, and the complex systems of kingship that would follow. But the memory of the modification remains. It is embedded in the laws that sought to regulate human behavior, and in the rituals that sought to maintain the distance between the humans and the gods. The Enlightenment in the garden was a double-edged gift. It gave humanity the ability to survive and reproduce, but also ensured that humanity would forever live within the shadow of its original purpose. The texts do not offer a resolution to this tension. They simply document it. They describe a world where humans possess the knowledge of the gods, but lack their authority. A world where the Eden is a memory of a managed past, and the future is an unfolding struggle for stability in a system that is no longer fully controlled. The Anunnaki had solved their labor problem, but they had created a new reality that would eventually demand even more from them. The workers were now enlightened. The seeds of civilization had been planted, and the momentum of those ancient genetic choices was carrying the story toward a destination that no one could fully foresee. This transition from the primitive worker to the self-aware human is the pivot point of the entire Sumerian narrative. It explains why we are as we are, possessing a capacity for high thought and complex creation, while remaining bound to the necessities of labor and survival. We are the result of a compromise made in the Eden, a biological solution to an administrative crisis. And as we look back at those ancient clay tablets, we see not a myth of a lost paradise, but a record of a profound intervention, a record of a moment when the logic of the mission met the potential of life, and the world was changed forever by the hands of those who needed help and the mind of the one who chose to give it. The silence of the text on the moral implications of this choice is perhaps the most telling detail of all. There is no judgment of Enki or Enlil. There is only the documentation of the outcome. The system was preserved, the work continued, and humanity began its long, complicated journey through history. The Eden remained as a reference point, a symbol of the origin of the spark that defines us. But the work of the Anunnaki was far from over. With a self-replicating population now spreading across the earth, the challenges of governance and the maintenance of order would soon reach a breaking point. The story was no longer just about extraction. It was now about the management of a new kind of existence, one that carried the image of the gods and the burden of the worker in equal measure. And in that balance, the next chapter of the human story would be written. The tension did not begin with a shout. It began with the quiet friction of differing goals. The tablets record a split that feels less like a clash of personalities and more like a division of management styles. In the Sumerian administrative record, two names dominate the landscape of authority. Enlil and Enki, their names are not just titles. They represent two distinct approaches to the problem that had brought them to Earth in the first place. The crisis of survival. Long before the first cities rose, the hierarchy of the Anunnaki was already under strain. The document described a structure where roles were assigned by rank, but maintained by results. Enlil, whose name is often associated with the heir and the command, occupied the seat of the enforcer. His responsibility was the fulfillment of the mission at any cost. Enki, the lord of the waters and the craft, occupied the seat of the implementer. His responsibility was the design and maintenance of the tools required for that fulfillment. This division of labor was likely intended to create balance, one to hold the vision, the other to manage the reality. But as the mission progressed and the pressures of resource extraction on Earth accumulated, this balance began to fracture. The Sumerian scribes did not frame this as a heroic conflict between good and evil. They framed it as a deepening rift in governance. Enlil and Enki represented two different ways of perceiving the environment they had entered. For Enlil, Earth was a temporary workspace, a site to be exploited with cold efficiency until the homeland was stabilized. His language is one of quota, regulation, and finality. He sought the fastest path to completion, even if that path required extreme measures. For Enki, Earth was a project that required intimacy, because he was the one who managed the extraction sites and the biological interventions. He became more deeply integrated into the world he was tasked with using. His language is one of adaptation, preservation, and complexity. This friction manifests most clearly in the way they viewed the labor force. When the burden of work became too great for the Anunnaki to sustain, it was Enki who proposed and executed the creation of humanity. The tablet suggests that Enlil accepted this solution only with reluctance. To him, the introduction of a new variable into a failing system was a risk. He saw the human workforce as a tool, a biological instrument to be monitored and constrained. When the human population grew too large or too loud, Enlil perceived it as a technical failure. Noise in these texts is a recurring theme. It signifies disorder. It signifies a system that has become too complex to manage. When the scribes record Enlil complaining that he cannot sleep because of the noise of humanity, they are documenting an administrator who has reached the limit of his patience with an unruly operation. Enki, however, viewed the noise differently. To him, it was the sound of a system functioning. Because he was the architect of the human design, he saw the growth and complexity of humanity as evidence of success rather than failure. He intervened repeatedly to prevent the total collapse of the workforce, not necessarily out of a sense of affection, but out of a commitment to his own craftsmanship. He was the problem solver who refused to see a solution erased. This divergence in perspective created a schism that would define the entire course of human history, as recorded by the Sumerians. The two figures represent the eternal tension between the desire for order and the necessity of life. Enlil is the drive toward predictable, controlled outcome. Enki is the drive toward resilient, adaptive existence. The tablets describe several instances where this rivalry nearly brought the entire mission to a halt. One of the most significant moments involves the distribution of the me. In Sumerian thought, the me were a set of divine decrees or protocols that govern every aspect of civilization. They were the blueprints for social and technical order. The texts describe a struggle over these protocols. Enki is often portrayed as the one who holds them, guarding the secrets of craft and knowledge. Enlil is the one who seeks to regulate their use, ensuring they are only deployed to serve the broader goals of the command. This was not a fight over magic. It was a fight over the control of information and technology. The one who controlled me controlled the future of the world below. As the mission continued, the administrative rift deepened into a systemic split. The seat of Enlil was Nibiru, a place of law, judgment, and centralized authority. The seat of Enki was Eridu, a place of water, wisdom, and experimentation. These two cities became the terrestrial anchors for their differing philosophies. Nibiru was where the Anunnaki assembly met to make decisions. Eridu was where the work of shaping the world actually happened. The distance between them was more than geographical. It was ideological. The scribes record debates in the assembly, where Enlil and Enki argued over the fate of the workers, the allocation of resources, and the duration of their stay on Earth. These records read like the minutes of a corporate board meeting under immense stress. There is no language of wonder here. There is only the weighing of cost against benefit. The climax of this rivalry is found in the account of the Great Flood. While later mythologies would describe the flood as a moral judgment on human sin, the oldest Sumerian records describe it as an administrative decision. Enlil, tired of persistent noise and the increasing difficulty of managing the human population, proposed a final solution. He sought the total removal of the workforce. He argued that the system was no longer manageable and that the mission had become a liability. The flood was not an act of anger. It was an act of erasure. Enki, however, could not allow the destruction of his most complex work. He understood that the total removal of humanity would also mean the end of the infrastructure they had built on Earth. His intervention was subtle. He did not directly defy the assembly of the Anunnaki. Instead, he worked within the margins of the law. He spoke to the wall of a reed hut, knowing that the man inside, Zayusadra, would hear his words. This was a subversion of the command. By warning Zayusadra to build a boat, Enki ensured that the seed of humanity would survive, forcing Enlil to accept a new reality once the waters receded. The aftermath of the flood was not a moment of peace. It was a moment of begrudging compromise. The tablets described a settlement in which humanity was allowed to persist, but under much stricter limitations. Lifespans were shortened. Labor was made more difficult. A greater distance was established between the creators and the created. This was the price of survival. This schism between the enforcer and the architect is the true legacy of the Anunnaki as they appear in the Sumerian record. We were not born into a world of unified purpose. We were born into a world shaped by a management dispute that was never fully resolved. The tension between Enlil and Enki remains embedded in the structures of our civilization. It is the conflict between the need for centralized control and the impulse toward individual agency. It is the struggle between the demand for quiet order and the messy reality of living growth. The Anunnaki did not leave Earth because they were finished. They withdrew because the internal cost of their rivalry had become too high. They left behind a system that was still functioning, but one that was permanently marked by the division of its builders. The scribes who recorded these events were careful to preserve both perspectives. They did not take sides. They understood that both Enlil and Enki were necessary for the world to function. Without Enlil, there would be no structure, no law, and no defense against chaos. Without Enki, there would be no skill, no adaptation, and no life. The rivalry was not a tragedy to be avoided. It was a condition to be managed. This practical outlook is what makes the Sumerian texts so compelling. They do not offer easy answers. They do not promise a return to a golden age of harmony. They describe a world of pressure, constraint, and difficult choices. When we read these ancient documents today, the voices of Enlil and Enki feel remarkably modern. We hear them in the debates over environmental management, technological ethics, and social order. We see their shadows in our own institutions. One side seeks to limit and regulate. The other seeks to innovate and expand. We are the inheritors of their disagreement. Humanity stands as the enduring evidence of a compromise that was made in a moment of desperation. We are the noise that refused to be silenced, and we are the craft that refused to be destroyed. As the narrative of the Anunnaki moves toward its conclusion, the focus on this rivalry becomes a way of explaining why the gods eventually became distant. The internal friction that had driven the arrival and the creation eventually led to a stepping back. The administrative burden of managing Earth and each other had grown too heavy. Authority was delegated to human kings. The me were hidden or ritualized, and the direct presence of command began to fade. What remained were the laws, the rituals, and the memory of a rift that could not be healed. The sky and the deep remained, but the conversation between them had moved out of human hearing. The story of the Enlil and Enki schism is the story of a civilization that outlasted its own creators. It is a reminder that even the most powerful systems are subject to the pressures of their own complexity. The Sumerian tablets stand as silent witnesses to this truth. They record the work, the struggle, and the eventual withdrawal of beings who found that even on a world as rich as Earth, balance is a fragile thing. And in that fragility, the next chapter of the human story was written not by the gods, but by the people who inherited their world, their work, and their rivalry. The transition from presence to absence in the Sumerian tablets is not marked by a single dramatic event. There is no sudden void left in the narrative, no moment where the scribes record a mass exodus into the clouds. Instead, the story of the Anunnaki on Earth begins to thin. It becomes less about direct administration and more about the structures they left behind to manage the world in their stead. The language of the text shifts away from the functional details of extraction and labor and begins to settle into the language of kingship, ritual, and memory. This shift is subtle, but its implications are profound. It suggests that the mission which brought them here, driven by the urgency of a collapsing environment elsewhere, had reached a point of resolution, or at least a stage of sustainable distance. The legacy left in the stars is often discussed as a matter of myth, but in the earliest layers of these records, it feels more like a handover of responsibility. The gods do not simply vanish. They withdraw. They step back into the background of the systems they established, allowing the machinery of civilization to continue under the guidance of those they fashioned to maintain it. This withdrawal is not framed as a betrayal or an abandonment. It is presented as a transition of authority. Kingship, as the Sumerian king list famously states, was lowered from heaven. This was not a gift of liberation. It was the delegation of management. The same systems of order, measurement, and allocation that defined the Anunnaki presence were now placed in human hands. As we look back at the reasons why they came, the nature of their departure becomes clearer. If the arrival was forced by necessity, the departure was likely enabled by stabilization. The tablets hint that the materials sought, the gold that was processed with such clinical focus, had served its purpose. Whether the atmosphere of their own world was restored or a new balance was found, the intensity of the extraction eventually fades from the record. What remains is a world rebuilt to function as a reflection of that original administrative logic. We see this in the way the early cities were organized, in the way the rivers were channeled, and in the precision of the calendars that governed both planting and worship. The earth was no longer a raw resource. It had become a regulated environment, a self-sustaining system that no longer required the constant intervention of its architects. The silence that begins to fill the space between the gods and humanity is where the modern sense of wonder takes root. For the ancient scribe, however, this silence was likely understood as the successful conclusion of a long emergency. When a crisis is managed effectively, the managers eventually become unnecessary. They recede. The urgency that once dictated every word of the tablets gives way to the repetitive rhythms of established society. The legacy left behind was not just the physical infrastructure of the first cities, but a psychological framework of hierarchy and duty that would persist for millennia. Humanity was left as the steward of a world it did not design, operating within a set of rules it did not invent. There is a particular weight to the idea that our oldest memories of the heavens are tied to this period of transition. When we look at the stars today, we see a vast, indifferent expanse. But for the people who lived in the wake of the Anunnaki departure, the sky was a record of authority and origin. It was the place where the decisions were made that shaped the ground beneath their feet. The legacy was not just in the stars themselves, but in the way the sky was used to measure time, to predict cycles, and to maintain the order that had been established under such immense pressure. The stars became the interface between the human administrators and the distant source of their authority. This shift from direct governance to symbolic presence is where the gods transform into the divine figures of later mythology. As the functional reality of their presence faded into the past, the memories of their administrative roles were reshaped into stories of power and mystery. The overseer became a judge. The planner became a creator. The engineer became a deity. This transformation allowed the systems they left behind to remain stable even as the physical presence of the architects vanished. By turning the memory of the Anunnaki into a matter of religion, the structures of kingship and law were given a permanence that transcended the needs of the original mission. The Sumerian texts preserve the final echoes of this process. They show a civilization that is deeply aware of its own constructed nature. There is no pretense in these early records that humanity arose from the earth spontaneously or for its own sake. There is a persistent sense of being part of a larger, older continuity. This awareness is what makes the legacy so enduring. It is a legacy of function. We were left with the tools to measure the world, the laws to govern it, and the compulsion to maintain order at all costs. These are not biological traits. They are cultural inheritances from a time when survival depended on the absolute precision of a workforce under strain. If the Anunnaki came to Earth as refugees of an environmental collapse, then their departure suggests they found a way to outlast that collapse. They left behind a planet that had been terraformed into a mirror of their own requirements. The legacy is the Earth itself, as we know it, shaped by the hands of those who needed its resources to survive. The rivers we still navigate, the soil we still till, and the metals we still covet are all parts of a system that was optimized long before our history began. We are the inheritors of a mission that succeeded, living in the quiet aftermath of a crisis that was resolved before we had the words to describe it. The silence of stars is not a sign that nothing is there. In the logic of the tablets, it is a sign that the work is being done. The systems are functioning. The hierarchy holds. The departure was a final step in a process of delegation that turned a resource extraction site into a civilization. As the narrative of the tablets moves forward, we see how this burden began to shape the very nature of what it means to be human in a world that was rebuilt to work. We look up not because we expect an answer, but because we carry the residual memory of an origin that was always oriented toward the heavens. The transition from the administrative to the devotional is perhaps the most lasting part of this legacy. When the direct orders stopped coming, the rituals began. Humans continue to perform the tasks they have been taught, but they perform them now as acts of worship. The processing of materials, the distribution of grain, the maintenance of the temples, all of these were functional duties that became sacred traditions. The legacy is a world where work and worship are inextricably linked, born from a time when labor was the only way to ensure the continuity of life. The gods left, but the work stayed. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration into the Sumerian texts, we are left with a picture of the past that is remarkably practical. It is a story of survival, of hard choices made under the weight of necessity, and the long-term consequences of those choices. The Anunnaki did not come to Earth to be gods. They became gods because of the scale of the problems they solved and the permanence of the solutions they left behind. Their legacy is not found in grand miracles, but in the mundane reality of our organized lives. It is in the way we measure a day, the way we structure our laws, and the way we look toward the horizon for a sense of purpose. The echoes of their departure are still audible if we listen to the tone of our own civilization. We still operate under the pressure of scarcity. We still prioritize extraction and utility. We still seek to maintain order in a world that feels as though it could drift into imbalance at any moment. These are the traits of a species shaped by a long emergency. We are the children of that urgency, carrying forward the momentum of mission that began in the stars and found its resolution in the red clay of the river valleys. The story of the Anunnaki is not a story of the distant past alone. It is a story of the present. It tells us why our world looks the way it does and why we feel the pressures we feel. It suggests that our history is not a random sequence of events, but controlled unfolding of a logic that was established before the first word was ever written. The legacy is the continuity. The mission continues through us, even if we have forgotten the names of those who first gave the orders. In the end, the tablets offer us a sense of perspective that is both grounding and unsettling. They remind us that we are part of a larger cosmic environment, subject to the same rules of resource and risk that govern those who came before. The sky is not just a canopy of light. It is a record of where we came from and a reminder of the fragility of the systems that sustain us. The legacy left in the stars is a quiet one, a silence that asks us to take responsibility for the world we have inherited. It is a world built for survival, and as we move forward, we carry the weight of that original necessity with us into a future that is still being shaped by the echoes of a departure that occurred thousands of years ago. The past is not behind us. It is beneath us in the structure of our societies and above us in the patterns of the stars. The reasons why they came are the same reasons we continue to strive, to build, and to look upward. We are the occupants of an old system, and our task is to keep it running, just as it was planned in the very beginning, when the first wet clay was shaped by hands that knew exactly how far those marks would travel. If the story of the Anunnaki teaches us anything, it is that survival is never guaranteed, but it is always possible, provided one is willing to do the work. The work continues. The legacy remains. The stars are silent, but they are not empty. They are the witnesses to a journey that is still unfolding, one generation at a time, in the world that was once chosen and never forgotten.